Welcome to Lesson 3 of Becoming an Effective Facilitator course of the Nonprofit Bootcamp e-learning series. Facilitation is an essential skill for a food systems leader and requires objectivity, active listening, and neutrality. This course will cover the key characteristics of facilitation, how to structure group discussions, and give you new tools to add to your facilitator toolbox. Today's presenter is Veronica Flores, the Chief Executive Officer of Community Health Councils and an adjunct associate professor at the University of Southern California Sol Price School of Public Policy. Prior to this, she was the president of Triple Notion, a consultant group providing strategic leadership and capacity building to nonprofits, public health agencies, and startups seeking to scale multicultural social enterprises and initiatives while increasing financial sustainability. For the past 25 years, Ms. Flores has held executive positions in both private and nonprofit sector organizations, as well as having a long history of activism on issues related to social justice, equity, and sustainability, and as such has co-founded various organizations, including Bienestar, the Audre Lorde Project, and California Collegiate Charter School, to name a few. She currently serves as co-chair for the Los Angeles County Community Prevention and Population Health Task Force and on the Charles Drew Medical University President's Advisory Council. We are so happy to have had you here for the last few courses, our last few lessons, and we're excited for this final one. So Veronica, it's all you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Well, unfortunately, this is our last session, but I have truly enjoyed this, and I'm hoping that through what we move on to today, you have been able to obtain some new skills, maybe learn some new tools. So we spent the first module really trying to provide you with information about some fundamentals that have to be in place in order for you to really build from there and being an effective facilitator. The last session, we moved into really thinking about what are some of the challenges, specific challenges, and what tools could be put in practice to support you in some of that work. Today, we really want to focus on one of the key principles of facilitation. The entire process and how well we do has to come to a place where you have to achieve an outcome, right? So this session will really help us to figure out how do you then take everything you've learned, right, and then move the group through a process utilizing a variety of different tools so that ultimately when people walk out of your group after being facilitated by your skills, they feel like, okay, that's the product, right? That was the goal that we had and we achieved that. So it's really important that we kind of think about then what are some of those challenges. We're going to talk about grades of agreement. That really help us to sort of get to an outcome, and ultimately, how do you achieve some of those tangibles through this process? And therefore, we do want the outcome of this is to improve your facilitation skills so that participants can effectively structure group discussions so that you may arrive at decisions. So, in putting together everything that we've already done, really we are now looking at the top 3 facilitation challenges that everyone encounters. It's not, it's a sort of a standard across the spectrum of facilitation. There are 3 major challenges that you want to make sure are sort of in your checkbox, right? One is that understanding that you cannot use a cookie cutter approach for a group particularly when that group has significant challenges or problems, right? So you're coming in to deal with some conflict resolution. You know that the group has some conflict, and so you're there to facilitate some of this process. You want to make sure that the approach that you use is maybe something that you've learned from, right? But really highlights the specific areas where conflict needs to be addressed. And so cookie cutter approaches is one area where it's a challenge for a lot of facilitators because we get used to what works for us. Secondly, our ability to really capture the group's ideas and voice. That's a challenge because that means you have to be able to really understand what are your options out there for ensuring that you're charting and keeping track and listening, right? So remember what we talked about in the first session. It's important that people really understand that as a facilitator, you are there to listen. You are there to take a neutral stand and really capture what they're saying. And so that's a piece that's also sometimes a challenge. And lastly, how do you really get the group, particularly when there's conflict or divergent views, so that people can come to a sustainable agreement? So that's some of the things that we're going to cover today. So starting with the first challenge, right? Not preparing well before a facilitation session and using a cookie cutter approach. So it's important that we think about all of the stages so that we can really walk away with an outcome. You know, trying to just, again, recap a little bit what we've learned, right? We really need to understand who the group is, why are you here, what is their purpose? Then the design really has to align with that. And ultimately, that blue piece is, how do you deliver it? That is really going to be important in your toolbox, right? How do I really get to this process where I'm now going to understand what the outcome will be? Secondly, when you think about this process, I put this section here on the left. I mean, there are lots of other things, right? But at least some things that are most common. You know, there are a ton of priorities, and everyone, you know, especially when people walk into a room, you know, part of what they do is they come with something that they own, right? And so you have to be able to think about a process. If there's going to be a lot of priorities and there's going to be a lot of, remember the brainstorming, idea storming that we talked about in the last session. When you do that, you also have to come in with a pretty solid process so that when there's a lot of priorities, you're going to be able to get them down to some agreed upon, you know, 3, 5, whatever it is that the group agrees with at the end, that should be the goal. Then you have to sort of, you know, really mold your setting and create the right atmosphere. You know, how do you do that? We talked a little bit about that the last time. Another issue is when we start to delegate to someone that may not have the capacity to respond. So understanding who's in the room, we talked about that in the first one as well. Understanding who's in the room and who can really help you and support you as you facilitate something that may be difficult. Secondly, thirdly, not including accountability it's usually a problem with time. And so you want to make sure that when you are coming up with follow-up items or what needs to happen is in terms of your goals, that your agenda really highlights that. So you want to make sure that you prepare your agenda so that people walk into this group understanding exactly why they're there, what you want to get out of this group by the time they walk out of there after an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and really make sure that people understand this is all we're going to do, and if we have to go over, we're going to all have to agree. And then you have to agree on an outcome. When the final approval is outside of the group's preview. So you have to really think about, here we have 5 priorities, but are those realistic priorities? Can we really get this done? And so the charting can really help you. So we're going to go a little bit over that today because that's a tool that there's lots of different ways to do this, but you want to make sure you track that. And then the follow-up. At the last session, we talked about there's this whole other part in facilitation, which is the follow-up. You want to make sure that there are next steps, if there should be, that you share those results, that people feel that there's accountability, but also that, you know, there's consistency from your perspective. Then the other part, right, is understanding what is that conflict. So you need to make sure that when you walk into the room, you have a pretty good sense of what the conflict might be, at least, if not for sure, so that you can then immediately begin to think about tools that are really going to help you figure that out. One of those tools that it's really actually effective is reverse role play. So you'll have this, the details of it, you'll have once you get the access to the slides. But one of the tools is that you can do reverse role play, and this can be, it's a 1 hour exercise. So if conflict is a real issue, remember we talked about this the last time, you want to make sure that you allocate enough time to every part of your session to get to the point where it's resolved, right? So if conflict is the biggest part, and really figuring out what the synergy is of the group and how you align those perspectives, spending time for people to see each other's perspectives is a hugely, greatly beneficial way to do this. So rather than open it up to everyone, let's talk about what the perspectives are and then find the divergence. You may just want to take a whole hour of the group just around reverse role playing. Some of those ways is that, you know, you put people in teams. And this exercise is can be 30 minutes to 1 hour, and it can be good for 6 people to 30 people. So it's a great way for you to then, you know, really move the group into some understanding of what the issues are. This is great for, again, issues relating to like power, overpower, sexism, ageism, you know, pretty hardcore stuff that we have to address. So you set up a situation where 2 people are talking and they're sharing each other's perspectives, right? And so really understanding, and then they need to report back. So you give a moment to say, the facilitator, then you can get people to sort of in positions, you are now X, and this is your perspective, and you're now Y, and this is your perspective. Now switch that role and see if you can understand each other's perspectives, right? And so you facilitate this session, and you move people back and forth between the X and the Y, and then you can take that, and it allows people to really shift from their own, you know, maybe very entrenched ideas into actually listening to somebody else, but not in an open group, right? And so you can do this where it's just 2 people. Remember we talked about pairing the last time, but you can also get this really well done by 4 people. You can start with 2. Then you can say, okay, now let's bring in 2 more people to this group. And then they sort of begin to really think about where the alignment is. And you give them the homework. And then they report to you. So it really takes away from the facilitator the stress of having to figure out just from an entire group process where a lot of stuff can go wrong. But you can certainly manage it by having people really sort of think through individually. The other part is once you get to this place where, okay, we have found, you know, the 10 plus priorities that we now understand and agree, right? You spent an hour in the group, but you now need to really think about how do we then narrow that down and then come to some consensus as to what the product will be at the end of the group. So prioritization is a big one. And there are different ways to do that. For example, one of them is you can use the idea of, okay, let's do a show of hands. That's a very quick way to do it. And so what you do is, you know, just say, we're going to write them all out. Here are the priorities. And then you keep track. You put little X's next to those. And you can say, you know, we're going to do this for 2 to 5 minutes. And you go through it. You say, okay, raise your hand if you feel like this is absolutely important. And we're going to talk about grades of agreement in a minute, so that'll help you. So combine this with the grades of agreement, and you'll see how it all sort of makes sense. But you begin to really think about what are you going to do. You know, if you want to make it a little more fun and you want people to move around, you can say, you know, just give me a thumbs up or give me a thumbs down, right? Just yes or no. You also can have spectrum. And the spectrum is that you have these dots. I'm sure many of you have participated in sessions, prioritization sessions, where you just use dots. And so, you know, red, blue, and green, most important, medium, and least important. Or this is my idea, this is maybe an idea I can let go, and this is not that important to me. So either way, I'm neutral. So you can define what those spectrum areas are, so that people know what the dots mean. But you can do either way, yes, no, or just give me a yes, medium, or low. So there are lots of different ways to do that, but prioritization is really, really key. Secondly, once you get to this place of prioritization, we really have to think about what is the consensus. Do you want to reach consensus, right? Or are we going to go, what is consensus here? Is it going to be unanimous, right? We all have to agree, full consensus, or is consensus majority rule? So first, we've already gone through identifying your priority areas, right? Secondly, which is something that this is a huge sort of fault with a lot of facilitators, is identifying or creating categories and then identifying those themes. It's if any of you do focus groups, it's similar to that. So really it's a way that for you to immediately jump into something and say, we understand that these are the categories, right, that are important to you. And I'm going to take you to an example as we move through, but then identifying the themes, right? And if you want to make sure that people understand where is it that we have alignment, that's really important. Always keep it in the positive. Here it is, right? Here's the alignment between all of us. Once you find those, then it's important to ask the group, what do you want to do now? Like, now we know, right? And so I think this becomes another opportunity for people to say, I see it. Now let me think about, do we want to take action? Do we want to walk away with something? This is what we said we wanted to do. So you just, in the middle of the group, are still confirming, so that when you walk out of this group, again, everyone is in agreement with whether it was their idea or not. And then also, I mean, you just have to agree that on the criteria, so that you can then sort it out and put the priorities accordingly. So consensus, that's a hard one, right? And so consensus is important in that, again, consensus doesn't mean we all agree. Consensus means we all agree that this is what we agreed to, right? Whether it's majority, unanimous, however it is that you want to do this, or 80% of the people, as long as 80% of the people say yes, then that goes. So that becomes majority rule. So you really just have to define what you mean by consensus. So I'm including here a couple of exercises around consensus. Again, this consensus, it's a critical issue. So you want to spend some time on that, and you can do it in a number of different ways, right? So sometimes you can start in pairs, again, and depending on the group. If the group is a group that's really well gelled, you may want to just split the group into a couple of different subgroups. But if it's a group that has, pretty divergent views, or you're still trying to figure out how to make them all sort of agree on something, you want to make sure that you then go from smaller to bigger. So you may want to start with each pair discusses the list of options, and they have to agree on their top 3 priorities. You then put each pair comes together with another group, and they form a 4 group. Now they have to look at those 3 and really think, look at their other 3 and just narrow those down to 3. The 2 pairs compare the list, right? The same thing. Each group then comes together with the 4 people come together with another 4 people. Now there's a group of 8. So it keeps the group moving. And again, it allows people to sort of hear from each other, and at the same time, you are getting them to do the homework for you, right? You're getting them to move and to think a little bit. And so it really helps to keep the group engaged. The other thing is, you could take and this is group for pros and cons. You can do that, just like a yes or no. You can just have, draw it up on the board and have, we're going to put all the pros and all the cons here. And you can just take 15 to 30 minutes. And this is good for, a group between 3 to 20 people. And you just say, these are the ideas that we have. Let's put them on. What does it mean to say it's pro, and what does it mean to say it's con, right? You just have to make sure that your definitions are clear to the group. And then ask them to then get up and go up there and prioritize them in that way. Then it becomes a process of, okay, now we know what the con means, so this may not be a priority for us right now. Low-hanging fruit, here's all the pros. Is there anything else that we need to add? And so then, prioritization can also start there. You can also start with that, right? And then move into the other group, 2 people, to 4 people, to 8 people. So there's different ways, again, depending on the size of the group and the content of the group. So here is, for example, an example of how you might prioritize and create some criteria. So you want to, for example, the criteria piece is just examples, right? So you could say, we're going to define it by these levels: importance, the time needed, depending on what it is, cost, if it's something that they have to make a decision about a project and the project is unfunded. And so you need to really think about what it's going to cost, right? And so if it's unknown, anything that fits into the last column, unknown, needs to analyze further. That's really where, if anything is unknown, or uncertain, the group needs to make a decision, because if it was a priority, but we're still very unclear about it, this is one of those where the next step would be ad hoc, right? We're not going to be able to do that here. It's clearly there's not enough information. So by doing this categorization, your conversations and your facilitation during that group process can be so much more focused, because a lot of times what happens with facilitators is we may take all of the conversation, all of the priorities, all of the things that are coming up, the content coming out of the group, and try to put it into a one single strategy, or maybe one single agreement. We say, we're going to take all of this stuff, prioritize it, and really put it into areas to next steps. But in reality, some of it you're not going to know. Or some of it may just be like, that's just way too expensive, so we're going to put a parking lot here. We talked about that. Always keep a parking lot, because there's some great ideas, but maybe in this short term, it's not the time. So, people see, okay, my idea is still up there and it's important. We just may not be able to do it right now. So here's, again, an example of how you might prioritize. But the gray side, the criteria, it's something that you would need to really think about before the group, right? Really help the group to, the criteria, it's about their priorities, their criteria is about what it is that you're supposed to help them facilitate at the end, right? The final product. So any of this is just examples. So now, once you do, and this is where you now become sort of the expert facilitator, right? There's lots and lots and lots of stuff out there on how to engage a group, how to move a group from one place to another, how, all of the stuff that we've been covering, and there's million more. But one thing that is really critical, and that becomes your sort of your own personal values, is you now need to, keep your toolbox open. And every time you experience, which is your experience, is you do a facilitation, there's a learning opportunity, right? And you should absolutely keep track of what worked, what didn't work. For example, particularly around some difficult situations, which is usually the hardest piece, and what really worked for you. Was there something that was difficult during the process that you may not want to do again, or you may want to do it a little bit different, right? So now we begin to really customize the way we facilitate. And then you want to reflect. It's really hard when it's just us. And so you may want to get a little feedback from some of the group participants. Is there anything I could have done differently? Would you be interested in just giving me some feedback? Or if you have people that you have, that mentor you, could you give me a little coaching session? Because this is the one thing I found hard in this group, and I don't want to do that again. So you want to make sure that you understand what worked and worked, put it into your toolbox, really keep track of it, codify what works. And then there's certain things that you're going to say, this particular exercise is great for any group, and so you keep that separate. Like, those are the generalized things, right? So you can jump into any quick group. Like, sometimes that happens, hey, we have this issue, we're going to have to meet in an hour. Who can facilitate? This is a moment where you have very little information. You may need to jump in. So here's your toolbox of generalized stuff. Right? And of course you're learning, and a lot of it's in the back of your head about what worked or didn't work, but you can now pick from there, right? And so as you develop this, You then put them into practice. They become part of your toolbox. So I can't emphasize this enough. I mean, as facilitators, we always have to stay on top of who we are, how we're doing our work. So, and I'm moving time. Oh, time. So next, important is how we chart what's happening in our meetings. This is really, really critical, and there's lots of different ways to do this. So one thing that, and I'm guilty of this, I have the worst handwriting ever, but, if you're going to keep track, people need to understand what you're saying, right? So I always say, I'm not going to be the one who charts. So you want to make sure that your charting is legible, that there's space between words so that people can look up and see it, right? And it's neat, that there's space in the paper, that you know where the paper is going to go, so that it's, you're not at the last minute like, okay, let's put this paper here. You have everything sort of laid out for people to understand. And one thing that's really interesting is using colors, because research has shown that if you chart by using different colors to highlight the importance of different things, that people retain information and remain engaged at least 98% of the time. So that's pretty high. So you want to make sure that you are being neat, you're using color, you're giving it space, and that you're not the one charting. So this is one thing I can't emphasize enough, is that many times we get caught because we're the facilitator. But being a facilitator and charting at the same time is practically impossible. So I would highly, highly recommend, don't ever do that. It's impossible for you to keep track of the group. I mean, remember, as facilitators, you have to make sure that you're tracking those body language, right? That you're making sure that you're keeping eye contact, that you're tracking who wants to talk, who hasn't spoken. All of those things are difficult at the moment. And so you want to make sure you have some support, and having someone chart for you would be a really important part. The other thing is then you want to organize stuff, right? Already you have like criteria, you're thinking thematically, but also as you begin to organize, you don't want it to look like what's on the left. And sometimes we do that, right? Because then you got to take this stuff and you're going to have to put it into some kind of structure. So you want to make sure that people understand what it is you're doing and how this data is being organized, right? And so if you put like in here around seniors, these are the priority areas that people have lighted. There's a problem with having family physicians. There's a problem with communication. So you know what your headings are, and then the bullets go under that. Dividers and bullets. How you can use any of these things, but just choose. If you're going to do bullets, stick to bullets. If you're going to do, little crosses, sometimes we'll say, I'm going to write this here, and then every time somebody else agrees with this, I'm just going to put a little star next to it or a little cross next to it. So that will mean that this idea came up multiple times. There are different ways for you to keep this going, but you want to make sure that people understand. So I'm going to connect the ideas, and then you find a way to connect ideas, right? So it doesn't feel like this mess of a chart. You also can do organizing, right? So you want to make sure there's Venn diagrams, there's lists, clusters. You can find, you map it a little bit. So just think ahead that these are your tools. And so as you're pulling the data together, think about what's the best way for the people in the group to feel like, okay, I get it, the thread. It's important to just keep the thread of your facilitation. So here's just the cheat sheet. So once you get this, it's just sort of broken down in 2 areas. You can do any of that. But remember, color is critical. And then lastly is the gradient of agreement. So this is really about making sure that you have a process. Here are some considerations for you to take a look at, right? Are you expecting the team to feel empowered? Are you needing to get buy-in? Are you dealing with an issue that's difficult immediately? So you want to make sure that you understand what it is that you're trying to do as you think about the method that you're going to use for agreement. You may want to just say this long part And so you put people into these categories, right? And you begin to narrow, so at least that if people really like it, that means there's no question. We don't even have to talk about it. And there's some people who are going to be totally on the opposite. I block this proposal, which means I don't care what is said. I'm just not into it. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to move from that. But most of the time, you want to get people in somewhere in the middle, right? And so at least it allows people to see, like, you know what, look at this. We're not that far from each other. Because then maybe what comes up is, I don't understand the issue well enough yet. Great. That means we need more process, more clarification, more maybe prioritization, so that we can move people to the left, right? So putting people in this category sometimes when you're not sure where they are, this is a great tool to use. Another way to do that is, you have to think about, is it buy-in or ownership, right? Is the lukewarm support that you're looking for is good enough, or does it have to be like, this is so important, the stakes are way too high, so we're going to need to come up with this. So clarifying what you need to get in order to walk away with a decision that feels good to everyone, it's really important. So putting closure, right? So one of the things around this gradients of agreement is that you need to also make sure that people understand, well, how are we making decisions? I mean, there's gradient of agreement and I can put my stuff in there, but then how do I really get there, right? So you want to make sure that you allow people to understand, we're going to make decisions in different ways, one good reading is this, How to Make Meetings Work. It's got some really great strategies there on bringing some quick consensus to a group. It's a small book, easy to read. You may want to use hand motions. We're going to move pretty quickly through this. And so we're going to make decisions. If you lift one finger, it's a yes. It's the same thing. 2 fingers is a no. And so you just keep track and you're charting this. So there are different ways to do this. Again, you put your chart up there and you start checking off based on the priorities. Polling is another way, right? You want to poll the participants to really understand, okay, let's take a pulse, right? And so you can then do this poll by saying, before we make a decision, let's see what kind of support we have here, right? And so you want to understand where people are at. So we can do a pretty quick poll, and then, you can just say, all right, how are people feeling so far? I want to see the hands up for if you're feeling like we should continue and we're almost there. Are you feeling hopeless? You can depending on the group, you can do a quick poll, people see where they are, move on, right? But ultimately, your goal is to make sure that whatever that decision is, people are in the same place. They walk away feeling like they were heard, whether it's their what they walked in with saying that they wanted to do, but they agree that the process was good enough for them to get their point out. So you then, by ending the discussion, you really have to think about, is the group voting? Like what strategies are you using? Is the group voting, or are you as a facilitator get to decide? So I'm going to take, and that happens a lot. As a facilitator, I'm going to take the lead on this, and we're going to take an hour to do this process. But ultimately, we're going to come down to 5 or 3 priorities. So I'm going to stop the discussion. So I'll make a decision when we get there, because I know what you all want. So I'm just going to take you through that. You also then want to talk about extending discussion for a limited time. That's another way of doing it. You want to then also maybe extend it to a specific issue. So everything is being worked out, but there's this one little thing that needs to be addressed. Well, you don't need to go through the entire process again. It's really about that one particular issue. So you now use some of your toolboxes to say, okay, now we're going to work this way. And the facilitator makes a decision. You also can say, as long as the majority agrees, we close the discussion. Majority agrees means 80-20 rule. So if 80% of the people agree, then that's great. But if 80% of the people disagree, that means you got to reopen the entire discussion and start all over again. Ending discussion and moving it onto a group is also a very good idea. If you only have a limited amount of time, this is a critical, high stakes issue. then you want to have that discussion when the group starts. Don't wait until the end of the group and say, okay, you know what, we didn't get it done. Let's now throw it out to a smaller group and bring it back to us. That's going to feel like you were unsuccessful. So you want to make sure that you start the group by saying, we'll have 2 hours together. It's critical that we get here. But, you know, what we're going to find out today is, do we have enough information to make that decision? And if we don't have enough information, then we may need to do an ad hoc. But it would be an information gathering group only, not a decision-making group. And so that there's a sense that this is a very deliberate process, and it may or may not be done by the end of it, but at least you let the group know that there's an alternative here. And you set the limit. You set the limit for that group process. So again, choosing how you want to end a discussion, it's important that you start from the onset. It makes your job a lot easier. And ultimately, remember, as a facilitator, you're troubleshooting constantly. This is who you are, constantly, right? You are developing interventions at the moment. This is an intervention now. Like, oh, this is happening. People are talking out loud. Okay, you know, disruption of the group. You got to be a constant intervention, but maintain your objectivity. That is so critical. And balance in the group, right? Again, how do you then make sure that everyone is being heard, that everyone feels like this is important to you, it's important to them, and understand the difference between being a facilitator and a leader. Remember, leader is when you look back and people are following you. Facilitator is when you are helping people move along the way and you're sort of in the back end. And finding synergy. There's synergy in everything that you do, from the very beginning, from the pre-planning to the actual implementation to the after work. You got to find the synergy of the group, because ultimately you're going to be the catalyst. And that's the important role of a facilitator. You are the catalyst for making sure that whoever is in the room and whatever situation you're dealing with, you are the one that's going to be able to help this group come to a place of productivity. So I believe in you, and I'm sure you all are doing and will do awesome.